first important theme that you talked of was variation, of why variation in nature, in genes, is so important for survival.
Yeah.
Right? That
Yes.
without, I'm sure that can also serve as a metaphor for cultural variation and diversity and so on. But the second important point that you make in the book is sort of carrying through this example of where a couple of nations got it wrong, was it's not just the genes you have, but also the environment that you have around
Absolutely,
you that plays a very critical role. And so it's not merely as simple as just saying you have this gene and therefore you're X or Y.
That's exactly right. So let's make that clear, and before we go on to the next step, which is to say that two things are worthwhile realizing. Number one is that biology is not destiny, although it plays a powerful role in destiny. So, in other words, the genes that you inherit intersect with the environment and with the elements of chance, with random chance, to ultimately produce us, ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean our bodies, our identities, our temperaments, our propensities, and so forth. It's very important to realize that it's a triple, I call it a majestic formula. It seems very simple, but genes plus environment plus chance creates phenotype. Is a majestic formula. It's one of the most beautiful things we've discovered about ourselves. And it's true across the biological world, but it's certainly true for humans, and so that's an important idea. And the second idea that's important is that typically most human traits, we'd already talked about it, height, but also diseases, are the product not of one gene but of many genes. Multiple genes have to intersect and interact in order to produce the phenotype. So there's the distinction that Richard Dawkins draws is a very nice one, which is that genes are not like a blueprint. It's not like your genetic code has, in section 1B, part 7, has something that says make a widget and put it here, and that is your ear. That's not how genes work. Genes work by interacting with other genes and then picking up information from the environment and thereby creating this thing that we call the ear, right? So and he calls it a recipe. So he makes the distinction between a blueprint and a recipe. Most genetic information is not blueprint information. It's not a one-to-one relationship between what is in the genetic code and what ultimately gets. Some of it is. There are some blueprint genes. I can name some. Most of it is not. Most of it is the fact that it behaves like a recipe. And in a recipe, there's no one-to-one relationship, right? You can't say that, at the end of when you bake a cake, you can't say, well, the butter formed the right side of the cake, and the raisins form the left side of the cake, and the whatever. I can keep on giving analogies. So, in fact, the cake, or your recipe, is a developmental process that occurred because of the intersection or the interaction between.
What you're saying is there's no left side of a cake or right side of a cake or anything.
Exactly.
It just says you need to have raisins in the cake.
Right? As long as you have raisins.
As long as you have raisins in the cake.
Exactly.
Right? So that very naturally then leads to what you were saying earlier. So if your destiny in some sense is a combination of genes, the environment, and luck.
Yeah.
So now, if we have the power to do something to genes and to sort of to cause variation by force through new technologies, but how important are the other two factors of luck and the environment? So you may make changes, but it may not really have the desired impact.
Right. So so now, what's important to realize that they come in a spectrum. So some diseases are some genes are very autonomous. So just to give you an example, the Tay-Sachs disease gene, the gene that causes Tay-Sachs disease, is an extremely autonomous gene in the sense that if you have the gene, you will have the disease. You're likely to have the disease. Cystic fibrosis, good example. If you have two mutations in the cystic fibrosis gene, chances are that you will have cystic fibrosis. If you have the Huntington's disease gene, chances are 100%. Environment, no environment, you will have Huntington's disease sometime in your life. Some people late, some people. Now, if you have the BRCA1 gene, the BRCA1 gene that causes breast cancer, it's a little bit harder. So there's a role of interactions with other genetic elements, and we don't know exactly how those interactions occur. Some people may get breast cancer. Some women will get breast cancer at age 24. Some will get breast cancer at age 50, some at 80, some will not have breast cancer at all. Now, if you have schizophrenia, there's not one gene, there are 4 or 5 genes, and the chances that you will, if you have that particular, one particular highest risk combination, maybe only 20% a higher risk than the normal population or the average risk. And so here comes the question, and now we're getting into the territory of the book. So, and I had not expected to write this book. I'd expected to write a book about combining memoir and family history and the history of genetics. But all of a sudden, the second half of this book puts out, I think, you know, and part of this reason is, and this is why this book has inserted itself into every conversation, which is, I'm going to throw out a question to you, which is, imagine yourself 10 years from now deciding to conceive a child with IVF. And you can biopsy the child's cells, and I tell you that I sequence the whole genome, and I ask, and I tell you that I have I can tell you there's going to be a 10% chance of the risk of a severe neurodegenerative disease. Would you implant that child? Right? What if I raise that number to 15% or to 40%? And I keep telling you that the other 60% could be potentially normal. There's a woman who's made the argument. She says, she's a genetic counselor. She says, I'll give you, and this is an example that she uses. I'll give you a 10% chance of a child of having moderate to severe Asperger's syndrome with a 10% chance that they will be Steve Jobs. What would you do? And this is the nature of the report card, as it were, that we will be experiencing in our children's lifetimes. If we wanted to, we could also reject the knowledge and say we don't want this knowledge, but we haven't in the past rejected the knowledge, right? We have not in the past rejected knowledge, for instance, because we test for Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a syndrome where, again, the penetrance is nearly 100%. If you have the extra chromosome, the child's likelihood of having Down syndrome is going to be nearly 100%. There's a range of syndromes in Down syndrome, right? Not everyone with Down syndrome has exactly the same syndrome, as it were. But we've made a decision socially that it's acceptable to take a child with that extra chromosome and not implant or not carry that child to full pregnancy. That decision was made 30 years ago and is part of our culture. Klinefelter syndromes, and so forth. I mean, I can go on and on and on.
But just before I close, I'll just say one thing, and then I'll request Siddharth to read a section from his book, and that is the very last paragraph of the book on what is natural.
But what is natural, I wonder? On one hand, variation, mutation, change, inconstancy, divisibility, and flux. And on the other hand, constancy, permanence, indivisibility, fidelity, bhed and abhed. It should hardly surprise us that DNA, the molecule of contradictions, encodes an organism of contradictions. We seek constancy in heredity and find its opposite, variation. Mutants are necessary to maintain the essence of ourselves. The genome has negotiated a fragile balance between counterpoised forces, pairing strand against opposite strand, mixing past and future, pitting memory and desire. It is the most human of all things that we possess, and so its stewardship might be the ultimate test of knowledge and discernment for our species.